Blind woman in a wheelchair is pushed off a cliff by a millionaire. Look what the canine German shepherd did. A millionaire's dark secret. A woman left to die. And a canine German shepherd who refused to let fate win. This is the unbelievable story of Mia, a blind woman in a wheelchair who was betrayed in the most brutal way possible. Pushed off a cliff, left to perish, with no one to hear her cries for help. No one, except for a German shepherd canine with an unbreakable spirit. What happened next shocked everyone. Get ready for a story of resilience, courage, and a hero no one expected. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this one. The sharp ticking of the grand clock echoed through the luxurious penthouse, blending with the soft hum of the city lights outside. The world of Khaled Al-Fayez, a ruthless and emotionless billionaire, was built on discipline, power, and unshakable control. He had no time for distractions, especially not for the nanny he had hired to care for his son, Omar. The boy, only 4 years old, had never known a mother's warmth. Khaled's wife had walked away from their lives shortly after giving birth, leaving only a hollow space that neither money nor influence could fill. In her absence, Amina, the African nanny, had become the closest thing to a mother figure the child had. She was hard-working, soft-spoken, and endlessly patient with Omar, but to Khaled, she was merely an employee, necessary but replaceable. That was the way he saw people, useful until they weren't. That night, however, everything changed. Amina ran her fingers through Omar's soft curls, humming a lullaby from her childhood as the little boy clung to her. He had been restless all evening, refusing to sleep unless she stayed by his side. She knew she was crossing an unspoken boundary. Khaled despised anything that made his son dependent on emotions. "Sleep, little one. Sleep and dream of the stars," she whispered, her voice a gentle lull. Omar's breathing slowed, his tiny hands gripping her shirt as he finally drifted into slumber. Amina exhaled in relief, leaning back against the plush cushions of the massive bed. She had barely slept the past few nights, always watching over Omar when nightmares jolted him awake. She told herself she would only rest for a moment, just a moment, before returning to her own small room in the servants' quarters, but exhaustion was merciless. Her body surrendered before she could fight it. The next morning, a deep, commanding voice pierced her dreams like a knife. "What the hell is this?" Amina's eyes shot open. Disoriented, she felt the softness beneath her, the warmth of a silk blanket draped over her body. Her heart stopped when she saw where she was, in Khaled Al-Fayez's bed. Her breath caught in her throat as her gaze locked with his. Khaled stood at the foot of the bed, towering over her with an expression she had never seen before. He wasn't just angry, he was studying her. She jolted upright, her hands trembling as she pushed the blanket away. "Mr. Al-Fayez, I don't know how—" "You don't know?" His voice was sharp, but there was no immediate cruelty in it, only confusion. Amina turned to see Omar still nestled against her side, sleeping peacefully. It all came rushing back. The lullaby, the exhaustion. She must have fallen asleep in Omar's bed, and at some point, Khaled had moved them here. But why? Her face burned with embarrassment. "I should go. I'm so sorry, sir. Before she could rise, Khaled's hand lifted slightly, a silent command to stay still. She froze. For years, she had only seen him as a shadow, a man of cold authority, untouched by tenderness. But now, as he stood there in the morning light, something was different. He was looking at her like she was a mystery he hadn't expected to find. "You're exhausted," he finally said, his tone quieter. Amina swallowed hard. "It's my job to take care of him." Khalid's gaze flickered to his son, his jaw tightening. For a man who had never let emotions rule him, he suddenly felt something unfamiliar and unsettling in his chest. For the first time, he saw how much she gave to his son, how deeply she cared. And for the first time, he noticed her. Khaled stood motionless, his sharp eyes still fixed on Amina. He had spent years perfecting the art of indifference, building a wall so impenetrable that no one, not even his own son, could breach it. But at that moment, something inside him shifted. Amina sat frozen on his bed, gripping the sheets as if grounding herself in reality. She had never been this close to Khalid before. Sure, she had seen him in passing, giving clipped orders, keeping his distance, but now he was right there, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Did you sleep here on purpose?" His voice was calm, but the tension behind it was unmistakable. Amina's eyes widened in horror. "No. I must have dozed off while putting Omar to sleep. I would never—" Khalid lifted a hand, silencing her. "I'm not accusing you." She swallowed, her heart racing. The Khalid she had come to know was ruthless, sharp, and impossible to please. But right now, he didn't look like a man ready to fire her. He looked intrigued. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple as if processing something foreign. "You've been working long hours." Amina hesitated. Was that concern in his voice? "I don't mind, sir. Omar needs me." Khalid's gaze flickered to his son, still nestled between them, his small chest rising and falling in peaceful slumber. A pang of something unexpected clenched his heart. When was the last time he had seen his son this content? He had built his empire from the ground up, pouring every ounce of himself into his business. But in doing so, he had let his son become a stranger. And now, here was Amina, a woman who had no wealth, no power, yet she had given Omar something Khaled never could: warmth. For the first time, Khalid realized he wasn't in control of this moment, and he hated that. He stepped back, his voice colder now. "You will take the day off. Get some rest. I won't have my son's nanny collapsing from exhaustion." Amina blinked. Was this really happening? The same man who had once scolded her for taking a break now ordering her to rest. I appreciate it, sir, but—" That wasn't a request. The commanding tone was back, and Amina knew better than to argue. Still, as she carefully slid out of bed, lifting Omar into her arms, she could feel his eyes on her. Not in the way a boss looks at an employee, but in the way a man looks at something he doesn't quite understand. Later that day, Amina had been given strict orders to rest, but how could she? Her mind replayed the morning over and over. The way Khalid had looked at her, not with anger, not with disapproval, but something else entirely. She paced in her small room, her simple cotton dress brushing against her legs as she tried to silence the strange warmth in her chest. This was dangerous. Khalid was her employer, a man so far out of her world that she might as well have been standing on another planet. Whatever had passed between them that morning was a mistake. But when the evening came, and she stepped into the living room to check on Omar, she found herself face to face with Khalid once more. This time it was different. He was standing by the window, his posture stiff, his hands tucked into his pockets. When he turned to face her, his gaze was quieter, softer, but no less intense. For a man who had spent his life untouched by emotions, Khaled Al-Fayez was beginning to feel something he didn't know how to name. And Amina? She was beginning to realize that this was only the beginning. Amina had spent the entire day trying to convince herself that nothing had changed, that waking up in Khaled's bed had been nothing more than a mistake, an accident fueled by exhaustion. And yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the evening settled over the penthouse, she found herself standing in front of his office door, hesitating. Omar had already gone to sleep, and she had no reason to be there, no reason to see him. But something in her heart whispered that after this morning's strange exchange, she needed to face him. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before knocking. "Enter." His voice was deep, unreadable, and when she stepped inside, she found him sitting at his massive desk, surrounded by the dim glow of the city skyline. Khaled barely lifted his eyes from the documents in front of him, but she knew he was aware of her every move. "Is there a problem?" he asked, flipping through pages as if their earlier encounter meant nothing. Amina swallowed. "I wanted to thank you for giving me the day off." His fingers stilled against the paper for just a second before he leaned back in his chair. "You shouldn't have needed it. You push yourself too hard." Her brows furrowed. "Omar needs me. He has nightmares. He doesn't like to be alone." Khaled's jaw tightened. "He shouldn't be so dependent. I won't always be here to protect him." Amina's heart ached at the coldness in his words. She knew Khaled wasn't a cruel man, not truly, but he had spent so long hiding behind his walls that he had forgotten how to feel. "He's just a child," she said softly, stepping closer. "He needs love, not just discipline." Khaled finally looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. There was something there, something unspoken, burning just beneath the surface. "And you?" he murmured. "What do you need, Amina?" Her breath hitched. The way he said her name, so deliberate, so unlike the detached employer he had always been, sent a shiver down her spine. She shook her head, taking a step back. "I should go. Good night, sir." But before she could turn, his voice stopped her. "You were right," he said suddenly, making her freeze. "I haven't been a good father." Amina slowly turned to face him again, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "You care about him," Khaled continued, his gaze softer now. "More than I ever have." Amina's heart clenched. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he could be a good father if he just let himself feel. But she knew that wasn't her place. Still, she found herself whispering, "It's not too late." Khaled exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "You speak as if you know me, Amina." She hesitated before answering. "I know what I see." And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Khaled alone with his thoughts. That night, Khaled found himself unable to sleep. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about stock markets or business deals. His mind was consumed by Amina, the way she had looked at him, not with fear or admiration, but with understanding, as if she saw something in him that he himself had forgotten existed. He had always prided himself on being in control, on never letting emotions cloud his judgment. But now, control was slipping through his fingers. The sound of rain began to tap against the windows, matching the storm brewing inside of him. Khaled knew one thing for certain. Amina was no longer just his son's nanny. She had become a disruption, and that terrified him. Amina tossed and turned in her small bed, unable to shake the memory of Khaled's voice, the way he had spoken, not as a powerful billionaire, but as a man. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. No, she couldn't let herself think like this. Khaled was untouchable, a man wrapped in power and wealth far beyond her reach. Whatever moment they had shared earlier was just an illusion. She needed to focus on her job, on Omar. And yet, deep down, she knew it was already too late. Because for the first time, she had seen the man behind the power, and she wasn't sure she would ever be able to unsee him. The morning air inside the penthouse was crisp and quiet, the usual sounds of the bustling city below muffled by the thick glass windows. Amina moved carefully through the living room, her steps light as she tidied up Omar's toys from the night before. She was trying to focus on her work, to pretend that everything was normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. Her encounter with Khaled the previous night had left something lingering in the air, an unspoken tension that pressed against her chest. She hadn't seen him all morning, and part of her was relieved. The other part, the part she refused to acknowledge, wondered if he was avoiding her. She pushed the thought aside and turned her attention back to Omar, who sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through a picture book. His dark curls fell over his forehead as he hummed softly, lost in the images. "You like this one?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Omar nodded enthusiastically. "It's about a lion. He's strong and brave." Amina smiled, brushing his hair back. "Just like you, The boy grinned, but his excitement faded as he hesitated, his little fingers tracing the page. "Do you think Baba likes lions?" The question hit her harder than she expected. Omar rarely spoke about his father, unless Khaled was in the room. "I think," she started carefully, "your Baba is a very strong man." Omar tilted his head, considering her words. "But is he brave?" Amina hesitated. Strength and bravery weren't the same thing. She had seen strength in Khaled, the way he commanded respect, the way he built his empire with sheer determination. But bravery, true bravery, wasn't about power. It was about facing what you were afraid of. And Khaled, for all his wealth and control, seemed afraid of something. Before she could answer, the deep timbre of his voice filled the room. "What are you two conspiring about?" Amina turned sharply, her pulse spiking as she found Khaled leaning against the doorway. His suit jacket was draped over his arm, the top buttons of his shirt undone, revealing a sliver of golden skin. He looked more relaxed than usual, but there was something unreadable in his gaze. Omar beamed. "Baba, Amina says you're strong." Khaled arched a brow, stepping into the room. "Does she now?" Amina swallowed, suddenly hyper-aware of his presence. She willed herself to remain composed. "Omar was just talking about lions," she said smoothly. "He thinks they're brave." Khaled crouched beside his son, ruffling his hair. "Lions only fight when necessary," he said. "They don't waste energy on things that don't matter." Omar nodded solemnly, as if this were the most profound thing he had ever heard. Amina, on the other hand, heard something else entirely. Was Khaled talking about lions, or was he talking about himself? She dared to look at him, searching his expression for an answer. But just as quickly as the moment had come, he stood up, adjusting his cufflinks. "I'll be home late tonight," he said. "There's a dinner I need to attend." Amina nodded, masking the disappointment she didn't want to acknowledge. But before he left the room, he paused, just for a second. His gaze flickered toward her, his lips parting slightly like he was about to say something. Then just as quickly, he was gone. Amina had just finished putting Omar to bed when she heard the front door open. Her heart jumped before she could stop it. Khaled was home. She hesitated in the hallway, debating whether to retreat to her room before he saw her. But before she could decide, he appeared at the end of the corridor. He had discarded his suit jacket, his shirt sleeves rolled up, the first signs of exhaustion visible on his face. His usually perfect composure was slightly off, and something about that made him seem human. "You're still awake," he noted. Amina nodded. Omar had trouble sleeping. Khaled ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "I see." A moment of silence stretched between them. Amina knew she should excuse herself, go to her room, and pretend nothing had happened between them the past 2 days. But something kept her rooted to the spot. Khaled shifted, his fingers flexing at his sides. "Amina," he said, her name rolling off his tongue with an unfamiliar softness. "Do you ever think about leaving?" The question caught her off guard. Leaving? This job, this life. Do you ever think about something more? She frowned slightly, searching his face. "I'm happy here," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she wasn't sure if they were entirely true. Khaled exhaled, looking away as if frustrated with himself. "I don't know why I asked that." But Amina knew. He was trying to understand her, trying to understand why someone like her, someone kind, patient, and warm, could exist in his cold world without being hardened by it. For a brief moment, she saw something vulnerable in him, something real. And that terrified her. She took a slow breath, forcing a smile. "Good night, Mr. Al-Fayez." Khaled hesitated, like he wanted to stop her. But then, with a small nod, he let her go. As Amina walked away, she knew she had just crossed a dangerous line, and so had he. The night was unusually still, yet inside the penthouse, Amina's thoughts stormed like an ocean in the middle of a tempest. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Khaled's question over and over again. "Do you ever think about leaving?" It was such a simple question, yet it carried a weight she wasn't prepared for. Why had he asked that? What did he mean by more? She had spent the past 2 years pouring herself into caring for Omar, into making sure the boy never felt alone in his father's cold, structured world. And now, for the first time, Khaled himself was looking at her as if she was the puzzle he couldn't solve. She turned onto her side, exhaling slowly. This was dangerous. Whatever was happening between them, these glances, these unspoken words, it couldn't happen. Because Khaled Al-Fayez wasn't a man who felt, and she couldn't afford to fall for a man who had spent his entire life refusing to love. The sound of a glass clinking from down the hall pulled her out of her thoughts. Amina hesitated, then slipped out of bed, her bare feet padding softly against the floor as she followed the faint noise. She found him in the dimly lit living room, sitting by the floor-to-ceiling windows. A crystal glass rested in his hand, filled with dark amber liquid, though it seemed untouched. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and his gaze was lost in the vast city skyline. She should have turned around, should have walked away before he noticed her, but something held her in place. "You don't usually drink," she said quietly. Khaled didn't look at her right away. He simply swirled the liquid in his glass, his expression unreadable. I don't. Then why tonight? He finally turned, and the way his dark eyes settled on her made her breath catch. Because tonight, I don't feel like myself. The word sent a chill down her spine. She took a careful step forward. Khaled. His jaw tightened at the way she said his name. No, sir. No, Mr. Al-Fayez. Just Khaled. Do you know why I hired you, Amina? He asked, his voice lower now, more controlled. She swallowed. Because Omar needed someone. He let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. No. I hired you because I believed you would be temporary. He set the glass down, standing slowly. People come and go in my life. Everyone wants something. Everyone is replaceable. Amina's heart pounded. Is that what you still think? He took a step toward her, and suddenly there was no space between them. Only him. His presence, his warmth, the quiet storm in his eyes that made her feel like the only thing anchoring him to the ground. No, he murmured. Her breath caught. She was frozen, trapped between the past she had always known and the dangerous present unfolding before her. This isn't right, she whispered, forcing herself to take a step back. Khaled's gaze darkened slightly, but he didn't stop her. He simply studied her, as if memorizing every unspoken word between them. I don't do emotions, Amina, he said, his voice raw. I don't know how. She clenched her fists, willing herself to look away, to break the spell between them. Then don't start with me. She turned before she could see his reaction, before her resolve could crumble, and hurried down the hallway. But as she closed the door behind her, pressing a hand against her chest, she knew the truth. She was already his, and there was no escaping it now. Amina spent the next few days avoiding him. She poured herself into caring for Omar, sticking to her usual routines, refusing to acknowledge the shift that had occurred between her and Khaled. But no matter how hard she tried to pretend, she couldn't erase the memory of that night, the way he had looked at her, the quiet confession in his voice. I don't do emotions, Amina. I don't know how. She should have been relieved, should have taken his words as a warning. But instead, all she could think about was the way his presence had felt. Dangerous, intoxicating, like standing too close to the edge of a cliff, knowing the fall could destroy her. But despite her efforts to keep her distance, Khaled wasn't making it easy. He watched her now, in a way he never had before, not just with passing glances or brief commands, but with something deeper, something unspoken. It unnerved her. And yet, it made her heart race. Late one evening, after putting Omar to bed, Amina moved through the silent penthouse, intent on retreating to her room. But as she rounded the corner, she nearly collided with Khaled. He was standing near the staircase, his hands in his pockets, his gaze unreadable as he blocked her path. Avoiding me doesn't change anything, he said. Amina's breath hitched. I'm not avoiding you. His eyes flickered with something almost amused. You're lying. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand her ground. I work for you, Mr. Al-Fayez. Whatever happened the other night, something happened, he interrupted. Amina closed her eyes for a brief second, exhaling slowly. It was nothing. Khaled's jaw tensed. You don't believe that. She stepped back, but he followed, closing the space between them. The air grew thick, charged with something she couldn't name. I don't get attached, Amina, he said, his voice quieter now, almost like a confession. I've never let anyone in, not in this way. Her heart pounded. Then don't start now. Khalid's expression darkened slightly, but not with anger. It was something else, something more dangerous. You think I can stop this? He asked, his voice a whisper. She wanted to say yes, wanted to tell him that this was impossible, that whatever pull existed between them would fade if they just ignored it long enough. But she knew she would be lying. Khalid reached out, his fingers grazing the side of her arm, a touch so light yet so consuming that it sent a shiver through her entire body. You make me forget who I'm supposed to be, he admitted. Amina's chest tightened. And who is that? He exhaled, his hand dropping to his side. Someone who doesn't feel. The words sliced through her. Khalid wasn't just afraid of emotions, he feared them. Feared what they would do to him. She should have walked away, should have left him standing there in the dim glow of the penthouse, drowning in whatever war raged inside him. But instead she whispered, maybe it's time you stop running from it. For a moment, she thought he might step back, retreat into the fortress he had built around himself. But then, he did something neither of them expected. He reached for her, and this time, she didn't pull away. Amina didn't know who moved first. 1 second, they were standing there, lost in the heavy silence between them, and the next, she felt the warmth of Khalid's hand as he pulled her closer. His touch was hesitant, as if he wasn't sure if he was allowed to do this, as if he had spent his whole life keeping people at a distance and was only now realizing what it meant to let someone in. Her breath caught as his fingers brushed against her cheek, his touch lighter than she had expected. His gaze searched hers, dark and unreadable, filled with something she couldn't quite name. This is dangerous, she whispered. Khalid's lips parted slightly, his thumb grazing the edge of her jaw. I know. Everything inside her screamed to stop this before it went too far, but the moment his forehead rested against hers, his breath warm against her skin, she knew she was already past the point of no return. For so long, Khaled Al-Fayez had been a man untouchable, cold, impossible to reach. But now, standing there with him, Amina saw the truth. He was just a man who had spent years running from emotions, from love, from the possibility of feeling anything at all. And now, against all odds, he was standing in front of her, choosing her. She closed her eyes, letting herself lean into him for just a second, letting herself believe, just for tonight, that maybe this wasn't impossible. But then, like a shadow passing over the moon, reality came crashing down. Amina pulled away, her hands trembling. We can't do this. Khalid's expression darkened. Why not? She shook her head. Because I work for you. Because you're you, and I... She swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Because men like you don't choose women like me. His jaw tightened. You think this is about status? I think it's about who you are. For a moment, she thought he would argue, that he would tell her she was wrong, that this was real, that whatever was happening between them wasn't something they could ignore. But then, just as quickly as the warmth had filled his eyes, it disappeared. Khalid stepped back, his face unreadable once more. If that's what you believe, he said coldly, then maybe I was mistaken. Amina's heart clenched at his words, but she forced herself to nod. Maybe you were. She turned before he could see the way her hands trembled, before he could hear the way her heart was breaking. She had told herself this would never happen, that whatever she felt for Khaled was a foolish, impossible dream. And yet, as she walked away, she realized something even more painful. She had already fallen for him, and now she had no idea how to undo it. Khaled watched her disappear down the hall, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had spent his entire life mastering control, ensuring that nothing, no one, could ever make him weak. But now, standing alone in the dimly lit penthouse, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: regret. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake letting her go. Amina tried to convince herself that leaving was the right thing to do. She packed her small bag, her hands shaking as she folded the few belongings she had. But as she reached for the door, Omar's sleepy voice stopped her. "Amina?" She turned to find the little boy rubbing his eyes, his curls messy from sleep. He looked up at her, confusion clouding his features. "Where are you going?" Her throat tightened. "I have to leave, little one." Omar's lower lip trembled. "But you promised you wouldn't." Amina felt her heart shatter. She had promised. And now she was breaking it. Kneeling in front of him, she cupped his tiny face in her hands. "You'll be okay, Omar. You're strong, just like the lion in your book." Tears welled in his big dark eyes. "But I don't want to be strong. I want you." Amina squeezed her eyes shut, trying to hold back her own tears. This was why she should have never let herself get too close. Because now, walking away felt impossible. But before she could say anything else, a deep voice interrupted. "Amina." She looked up, her breath catching. Khaled stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk." Khaled led her to the balcony, the city lights stretching out beneath them. The night air was cool, but the warmth between them was undeniable. He turned to face her, his dark eyes filled with something raw. "You think I don't feel, Amina? That I don't know how to love?" Amina swallowed. "You don't." Khaled took a step closer. "Maybe I don't. But I know one thing." His voice was rough, almost desperate. "I can't let you go." Her breath caught. "I tried to fight this, tried to push you away, but it didn't work." His fingers brushed against hers, hesitant, searching. "You make me want to be better. For Omar, for myself." Amina's heart pounded. "Khaled." "I don't deserve you," he admitted. "But I'm asking you to stay, not as my son's nanny." He exhaled, his voice almost breaking. "As mine." Amina looked up at him, searching his face for hesitation, for doubt. But for the first time, there was none. Khaled Al-Fayez, the man who had spent his entire life running from love, was standing in front of her, choosing her. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "You have no idea how long I've wanted to hear that." Khaled reached for her then, pulling her into his arms. And as she melted into his embrace, she knew this was home.